Hi, I'm Anna Bunce, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the Climate Action Secretariat, which is part of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. I'm recording this on the beautiful territory of the Lekwungen peoples, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and taking leadership on climate action. This video will give you a sense of what the province's CleanBC plan is, how far we've come, and where we're going. This overview supports our discussions over January, February, and March of 2021. So what is CleanBC? CleanBC is the province's pathway to a more prosperous, balanced, and sustainable future. It's a climate plan to meet our 2030 emission targets, a blueprint for a sustainable competitive economy, and it's a commitment to prepare for the impacts of climate change, which we're already seeing in our communities today. Just because BC is a small jurisdiction doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play in reducing emissions, and we are setting an example for other jurisdictions to follow. We're aiming to reduce our emissions by 16% by 2025, 40% by 2030, and 80% by 2050. Emissions in BC come from three main sectors: transportation, industry, and buildings and communities. Transportation makes up 41% of our overall emissions. About a third of this comes from personal transportation, about a third comes from heavy-duty vehicles like commercial transport trucks, and another third comes from transport modes like ferries and the railway. Industry makes up 39% of our total emissions. About half of those industrial emissions come from the oil and gas sector, and the other half from agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and other industries. 21% of our emissions come from buildings and communities. A quarter of that comes from waste, a little under a fifth from deforestation, and the rest comes from our buildings, both commercial and residential. So how are we reducing these emissions? Well, by making electric cars more affordable, investing in infrastructure and clean fuels, by increasing the efficiency of our industries and electrifying them, and creating clean energy jobs, by helping people conserve and switch to cleaner energy in their homes and businesses, and exploring new innovations in building materials, and by diverting organic waste and capturing methane from our landfills. We know that the climate is changing. We are seeing weather patterns changing, and these changes are increasing the risks we face. From 1880 to 2012, the average global temperature increased by 0.85 degrees Celsius. Oceans have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and the sea level has risen. We recognize the way Indigenous communities are experiencing these changes and impacts is unique. We've heard that climate change is having serious impacts on Indigenous communities, Indigenous cultures, health, and livelihoods. We're expanding our capacity to assess risk, to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing, and to respond to the impacts of climate change. The province is accountable for completing a determination of risk every 5 years, as well as sharing the actions we plan to take to help prepare for and adapt to these changes and risks. And we're working in collaboration with Indigenous peoples on a new strategy to help respond and prepare to these risks. We have started to see progress. For example, we know that in 2018, about 7% of the fuels we used included renewable content. This is up from about 4% in 2010. In 2019, 10% of homes have heat pumps, up from 3% in 2007. Our industries have started to decarbonize. The emissions from our natural gas sector are improving, and we're supporting innovation and electrification of our heaviest emitters. Even though we've made good progress, our latest understanding is that we are not yet on track to meet our goals. With the programs and approaches in place today, we will only meet between 56 to 72% of what we hope to achieve by 2030. This means we have more work to do. The province has committed to releasing a detailed roadmap by the end of this year on how we can meet our targets. We've also introduced legislation to keep us on track, and the province must now report every year on the progress of our climate action to the legislature. Indigenous communities are climate leaders. There are many examples to look to, but to name a few, Kanaka Bar has a strong focus on resilient self-sufficiency. With funding support from the CleanBC Communities Fund, Kanaka Bar is building the Crossing Place, which will be energy self-sufficient housing. The project will avoid the need for fossil fuel heating and support the development of 20 affordable housing units in Lower Kanaka, powered by solar and wind technology with battery storage. The idea is to demonstrate a replicable, affordable, sustainable, resilient development where the foundations of clean air, water, food, shelter, energy, and communications meet to address public concern around climate change. Kanaka Bar is also addressing community food security through increased food production, processing, and storage. Doig River has designed a cultural centre following energy-efficient passive house design principles, which you can see here. The centre will be warm and comfortable and save community energy costs. Skidegate worked to lower energy costs for members by installing energy-saving upgrades, like heat pumps, with support from BC Hydro's Indigenous Communities Conservation Program. Tsleil-Waututh Nation, through funding support from the Government of Canada's First Nations Adapt program, is in the early phases of their Community Climate Change Resilience Planning process, which has helped build an understanding of community vulnerabilities to climate change and to develop a climate change action plan. Tsleil-Waututh Nation will soon be moving to implement the Climate Change Action Plan. Nations are taking leadership to build clean energy community projects, energy-efficient homes, and buildings that are comfortable and affordable. The province and others are working to support this leadership through funding programs like the CleanBC Communities Fund. We're listening and learning from Indigenous communities so that we can improve and develop CleanBC programs and policies. In spring 2019, we held 10 regional engagement sessions in 9 communities across BC. We met with elders at the 43rd Annual Elders Gathering in July 2019, and in January last year we held a 2-day CleanBC Indigenous Engagement Forum in Richmond. We regularly have one-on-one meetings with Indigenous nations, and we have monthly meetings with the BC First Nations Leadership Council Technical Working Group on climate change. We have engaged with remote communities on the development of a remote community energy strategy through both individual one-on-one meetings held in the summer of 2020 and through a broader remote communities virtual gathering held in December 2020. We will continue working collaboratively with remote communities to develop the remote communities energy strategy moving forward. We organized an Indigenous Climate Adaptation Technical Working Group and invited all nations to attend virtual discussions in summer 2020 to shape the development of a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. And we have been grateful to attend and participate in climate action engagements led by Indigenous nations and organizations. From those discussions, we have heard themes around, for example, sustainability. Participants shared that sustainability is a core value for many Indigenous communities and peoples. We also heard, though, that Indigenous communities have not been the primary cause of global warming, and there should be a view to fairness in who bears responsibility to reduce emissions. Balance. Many participants spoke to the need to consider resource development in balance with goals on the environment and climate. Regional diversity. We've heard clearly that policies and programs that work in one community may not work as well in other communities, and we need to work closely with communities on these ideas. Poverty. Participants highlighted that addressing poverty for Indigenous peoples is a more pressing issue than CleanBC, and in some communities, this is a necessary prerequisite to meaningful community action on climate change. Indigenous knowledge. Participants shared the importance of working with communities in a respectful manner to treat Indigenous knowledge on par with Western knowledge, and to learn from the wealth of knowledge held by Indigenous communities. Reconciliation. Some participants noted that the province's climate change efforts should not be linked to reconciliation, particularly without noting the truth in Truth and Reconciliation. Climate change impacts. We heard that Indigenous peoples are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, such as wildfires and floods, and have knowledge of how to prepare for and adapt to climate change. We want to thank all of you who have shared with us over the last 3 years. Our strategies, policies, and programs are better because of your input. We've been listening and would like to share a few examples of the ways we've made changes. We heard that it was difficult to get funding to support fuel switching and energy efficiency projects, and so we improved the Indigenous Community Heat Pump Incentive and the Indigenous Community Energy Coach, who will help identify and discuss funding opportunities for space and water heating fuel switching projects. We heard that the funding application process for many communities is a barrier, even just to find the right programs, so we're bringing funding bodies together to improve coordination, including through a new community funding website under development now. We also heard more help is needed to apply for funding programs to assess things like greenhouse gas reductions. So for the CleanBC Clean Communities Fund, we offered technical advisory support and supported 25 communities to develop applications. We heard about challenges in the switch to clean transportation, so we will be introducing increased funding opportunities for Indigenous communities interested in having electric vehicles in their fleets. We've also increased rebates for the installation of home or workplace chargers and public electric vehicle fast charging infrastructure. We heard that climate change is impacting Indigenous cultural heritage sites and values, and so we are beginning to work with the First Peoples Cultural Council to pilot approaches to preserve Indigenous cultural heritage sites and values in the face of a changing climate. While we've made progress, we know there is more to be done together. So where are we going and what's next? We're working on implementing CleanBC's commitments. We're supporting a clean economic recovery from COVID-19, and there is new accountability and responsibility across all ministers' mandates for climate action and for lasting and meaningful reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We are working on our pathway to reduce emissions, support clean economic opportunities, and meet our climate goals. There's a lot of programs underway and in development, including the CleanBC Go Electric programs, which support the uptake of electric vehicles, the transition to electric vehicle fleets, and the development of charging infrastructure, to name a few. The CleanBC's Community Fund, which supports community-owned climate infrastructure like Kanakabar's energy-efficient housing project, with new funding intakes this year. The CleanBC Remote Community Energy Strategy, which is working to help remote communities reduce diesel consumption by building community capacity, improving energy performance in new and existing buildings, and implementing renewable energy projects. The Better Homes and Better Buildings programs, which help us improve building efficiency. The Indigenous Community Energy Coach, who can help navigate heat pump and energy efficiency funding programs and opportunities for Indigenous communities. We are in the process of developing a BC hydrogen strategy to grow BC's hydrogen production pathways, use of hydrogen, and economic opportunities. And we are developing a BC bioenergy strategy to develop economic opportunities and reduce emissions from fuels through the production and use of bioenergy in BC. We are collaborating with Indigenous peoples on the development of a climate and preparedness adaptation strategy, as well as elements of climate preparedness like BC's flood strategy, and we're improving how Indigenous interests and values are integrated into our understanding and assessment of climate risks. The province is also supporting the development of the First Nations-led First Nations Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan under development by the First Nations Leadership Council. On all of these efforts, we look to opportunities like this one to have discussions and seek advice from Indigenous partners. On each of the programs I've mentioned and others underway, we are working on additional engagement later this year, and we are always happy to connect with you and members of your community on your priorities for climate action. It is the thoughts, experience, and ideas shared with us so far that helped us get to where we are today. Thank you for making the time to join us today to continue the conversation.